Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Welcome back to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism. I'm your host, Adam, with my co-host, Mick Mulroy. Today, we were going to talk about something near and dear to my heart and my work, but I think we're going to let Mick kick us off today. So, Mick, do you have any opening thoughts for today's topic?
Yes, and the reason why I'm talking about it, or at least I'm asking the questions, is because it is your expertise. So something we've wanted to talk about for a while, because who's not interested in space travel? But we have a big event coming up, which I think would be best for you to describe, but I think the whole world should be interested in it. And I
Yeah.
will start with a pretty broad statement. And I, of course, acknowledge that, why are we talking about space travel in a Stoic podcast? Well, I think it's because ultimately one of the main purposes in humanity is exploration. And this is the ultimate
Yeah.
exploration. I think it gives the entire, maybe this is a lofty, overstated, but I don't care. This is what I think. It is the purpose of mankind to be able to explore places that no other species that we know of
Yeah.
has done, which is, of course, interplanetary and potentially eventually interstellar. But Adam, to start off with, can you explain the big event that has spurred our uh, interest in talking about this today, and what's going to happen there, and what's the significant for science and mankind?
Yeah. So, as we're recording this, we're about 3 days away from the first launch of astronauts to go around the moon or anywhere near the moon, really, since 1972. The mission that is coming up is called Artemis II, and 4 astronauts, 3 Americans and 1 Canadian, will fly and do a lunar flyby. But they have some other tasks they'll be doing as well on the mission, which I think is pretty interesting. But that mission is going to be what they call it a launch window, because there's a period of time in which the moon and the Earth are in the optimal position for, you know. Um, ease of mission, fuel efficiency, things like that. And that launch window opens on Wednesday, April 1st in the evening. I think it's about 5:30 p.m. Eastern time, and they'll be launching out of Cape Canaveral at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, in the United States. And that's a big one coming up. The first um, woman to travel to the moon will be on this mission, and the first Canadian to travel to the moon will be on this mission. So it's got a lot of firsts to it. And also, because of the timing, the mission comes at a time where NASA has decided to make a big push, and this is all in the news, right? Decided to make a big push towards having boots on the moon as quickly as possible. And so the Artemis II mission kicks off sort of a multi-phase approach to start preparing for, manned lunar landings coming up as early as Artemis IV, which is just 2 missions from now. So it's a very big time for us, and the exploration bug is high. Like I really echo what you talk about with this, which is this feeling of the new frontier. So I have a personal connection that's indirect to this mission, which is that I work with the space program here in Canada, and I can tell you that I also very specifically work with manned space flight, which is because working with something that flies in space is a little bit less uncommon, but working in manned space flight is a very specific field kind of that you work in, and it's a very small group of us. It's a very big group, but a very small group at the same time. And so I work on the Canadarm3 program here in Canada, which is meant to build the next robotic Canadarm for use in space. And so I have been connected to this. I'm closely watching the lunar missions and whatnot, and that's something that we're working on.
So
So,
when you say
oh, sorry.
window, I mean,
Yeah.
I know there's, because I do this a lot when I'm talking about military stuff. I just assume people understand it.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, because we say that as if, and then most people go, okay, there's a window. What does that mean? Is that a window based on where the moon is located in relevance to the
Yeah.
Earth, or why do we call it a window?
Yeah, it's really related to like orbital mechanics. You want certain things to be in good position so that it's a pretty quick trip. The sort of casual way to describe the mission is they'll be launch and they'll arrive in Leo, low Earth orbit, and they'll do a bunch of stuff there. They're going to do some testing. I was checking out the NASA Ignite, or I think it's called Ignition, press release that event that they had last Tuesday, which was that's on YouTube now, and you can watch that. And they talk about this mission, but it's really about the efficiency of the orbital mechanics because they get to low Earth orbit, and then they're going to do some testing, and then they're going to do something called TLI, or translunar injection, which is trans meaning travel, right? And then lunar injection means you're going to do a rocket burn so that you have enough energy to travel towards the moon and escape the Earth's gravity, or at least start to. And then what you're trying to do is sort of catch the moon. You're trying to sort of catch the moon. You sort of have to think of them as it's not that the moon is a stationary object and a rocket is flying towards it. It's actually that both objects are moving and you're trying to meet them in space. And so, and I'm explaining this terribly, but because I'm not an
No, no,
orbital mechanics
no.
specialist, but that's really what it is you have to think about it like that. It's like two pool balls that are moving on a pool table and you're trying to make them meet, except that it's in three-dimensional space with time as well included. And so you do this translunar injection and you fly along. And then once you get over there, they're going to do what's called an LOI, a lunar orbit insertion, which is a burn, which is another rocket burn, where they're going to basically be trying to slow down so that they catch the moon and then they get caught by its gravity and they can go around it in. It's called a free return trajectory, which means they're going to use the moon's gravity to swing around. And every Apollo 13 fan knows that term because that's how they brought Apollo 13 back. But like I said, this window is because there's a period of time in which it's literally a window of time from say 5:30 p.m. or whatever on Wednesday, April 1st. There's a period of time where you're in the most optimal position for the fuel you have, the oxygen you have, the maneuvers that you have to perform. And so when we see this launch for at least the first week, they're all night windows, which is interesting. You'll see it on April 1st. Like I said, I think it starts at 5:30 Eastern. I think Thursday or Friday it starts at 8, like because we're all moving through space, right? And so that's why it's called a window. And it's an interesting concept when you think about it, because if you have a glitch, which is just like something not going according to plan when the rocket's on the pad and you're waiting to launch, if something goes wrong, that glitch, you could fix it. But if you fix it and you're outside the window, you got to wait for tomorrow, or you have to wait for the next week or whatever it is.
So I mean, can you explain why we're not doing a lunar landing on this one? Why it's just a
Yeah,
flyby?
sure.
My
Yeah,
term,
sure.
obviously not.
Yeah, sure. And again, I'm not really an expert on Artemis specifically because I was working on a different part of the space program, but this is still pretty easy to kind of explain because you have to think about it. And there's a very stoic concept about this. Actually, we're going to get into some of that for sure. But what happens is that um, uh, we're not gonna go somewhere that's as risky as the moon, right? It's got no atmosphere. It's only 1/6 gravity. It gets irradiated every day. It's extremely cold and extremely hot, depending on which side you're on, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't land there unless we have a chance to test out the items that we're testing. The big issue we have here is that we don't have a lunar lander that's currently certified for flight on the moon. They're definitely being developed. I'm not speaking for anybody to say that they're not being done. It's just we don't have a lunar lander that's ready. So what they're doing is they're doing a phased approach to the moon in order to give time to develop these other technologies, but also to essentially check off a couple of big features that we have to make sure we get done. So a bit of a quick history lesson. Back in the 60s, when the first moon program was happening, the NASA administrators devised a plan where they were going to do it in sort of a stepped approach. So it was like Well, what do we have to figure out to get to the moon? Well, first we have to do is we have to be able to orbit the Earth, and then we have to rendezvous in orbit, which means that's where two craft or two bodies come together and make contact with each other, right? We have to, or not make, make contact, not always physical contact, but they have to be very close together. We have to be able to detach from each other and return. We have to do something called an EVA, an extravehicular activity. That's a spacewalk when you're in a spacesuit. We have to do all of these things. And so back in the 60s, they did it in a phased approach. So in the Gemini program, which was the one right before the moon program, they had all of these things getting checked off. So on on the early Gemini flights, it was just getting up there and rendezvous, and then it was EVAs, and then they had one where you had to do a rendezvous, and then it was docking. So that's where you're physically connecting to another craft, and then they're doing it as a stepped approach. And then in Apollo, they had a very bad start to Apollo. The Apollo during the Apollo 1 testing on the pad, they had a fire, and there was actually a very good documentary about Apollo 1 that just came out recently, and I highly recommend anybody watch that film to know the kinds of accidents that can happen in such a high risk, high technology environment. But after the Apollo 1 fire, they did a bunch of unmanned flights. And then starting with Apollo 7, they did it where they flew the crew module. That's where the astronauts were living. They flew that around the Earth and they tested it out. And then for Apollo 8, it's an interesting story because Apollo 8 is the matching mission to this one that's coming up, to Artemis II, which is Apollo 8 was the first time we flew around the moon. And it was Borman, Lovell, and Anders. They were the three astronauts on it, and NASA had a decision to make. They had no working lunar lander yet. It was really struggling. They were struggling at NASA to get it what's called checked out, which is getting it ready for flying on a rocket, and it wasn't really working. So they said, okay, well, we're going to fly around the moon. So they did. So the flight around the moon was really great because it allowed them to test and show off the capabilities of the crew module, but it allowed them to also give the people on Earth time to prep the lunar lander. And then in Apollo 9, they tested the lunar lander in low Earth orbit. And then in Apollo 10, they tested the lunar lander in lunar orbit. So they were at the moon and the lunar lander was flying around its own. And then in Apollo 11, we have the fateful landing of Armstrong and Collins. And that's a really long way of saying we're flying around the moon right now because we're doing this phased approach where we're testing systems that we know are good and working. Artemis 1 was an uncrewed flight, and it flew around the moon, and it went very well. So we're flying Artemis 2 with crew inside the crew module, and then they're going to test it out, and they're going to come back. And then the plan for Artemis 3, the next mission, is where we'll see a lunar lander come out because it's not really ready, and it's not really time. We're not really ready to do that yet. So that's a long answer, but that is the best answer.
No, that's super helpful. I'm telling you that as somebody who has always been somewhat of a space exploration geek,
Yeah.
I didn't know a lot of that. And I think, this spikes when things like this happen and people all of a sudden get interested. I understand why that's the case. They have their own lives,
sure.
But it'd be really helpful, to be frank, if folks in the media would bring on more people like you to explain these things, because it's for multiple reasons, just out of interest and because, to be frank, it costs a lot of money, right? So you really should explain to the people who ultimately are flipping the bill why this is important. Now, obviously, I agree with it, and so that's not the point of me bringing that up. But there's a lot of people who don't follow this stuff and aren't space geeks, and I think it's really helpful that that people understand why this is the case. So other questions, and I do want to get into the Stoic application of this, because that's
ask me what you like. I'm used to getting these questions. I think I've told you this story. I went to a lunch one time. I'll tell you this quick story just because it's okay. I want to make sure it's totally okay. I went to this lunch one time with family friends that I hadn't seen in about 10 years maybe. And we were walking up to dinner the lunch, and my uncle was with me, and I said to my uncle, "Look, I'm just going to tell you, like, if they ask me lots of questions, it's okay." And he said, he was kind of like, "Yeah, okay." Like, he'll probably ask you a couple of questions. and the first 3 hours of the lunch was just them asking me space program questions. So
Be
it's
happy
pretty
you have
common.
people
It's like
want
if
to
you work in
hear
the
about.
space program, you have to have questions. You have to expect to
Yeah,
get questions from people.
yeah. Believe me, I know. Same kind
Yeah,
of thing with
and
the
same with
CIA.
you.
Believe me.
I've definitely peppered
Yeah,
you with questions on your job, so I totally get
and somehow it ends up in space too. Isn't that interesting?
it. That's funny.
Yeah,
Yeah,
especially planes. I stopped mentioning where I worked before.
yeah,
But okay, so there's a lot of discussion on this idea that we're going to colonize, not colonize, but we're going to put a base, I should say, a lunar base, obviously on the moon.
hmm
Um, why is that important? What, and, it's $20 billion is the number I've seen.
yeah,
Why is that important for human space travel writ large? What exactly will they do there, and how will it advance, the entire, enterprise of
yeah.
human space exploration?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll always open that kind of question because I get a lot of questions from parts of the space program that I don't directly work on, though I usually am, I have to know certain things, right? Is that I don't specialize in the lunar program. I mean, it's basically a week old. It's not even a week old. It started on Tuesday, this landing program that they're now introducing. But I mean, if you talk in the bigger concept side of things, right? Like the first thing is, why is this important to the space program? That's the easy one to answer. There is a larger initiative, right, of going to Mars, and that's one of those big things. Mars is very similar in size to the Earth. It seems to be about the same age, but it has sort of different aspects to its environment that we would want to study, but also. It's just a really interesting place to see where the birth of the solar system happened, right? And so the thing is, though, right, and I'm sure everybody does this. Like, if you're going on a long road trip, right, in Ontario, where the province that I live in, you might check on the map and see where all the en routes are, which are the stops on the highway on the way. In space, there isn't really a lot. So if you need to use the loo, you can't really roll down the window and take a look for a 7-Eleven. You are in a spot where you have to make figure out a way to make it safe, right? Well, the moon is an easy start for being um, uh, a waypoint on the way out there. And the program that I have worked on is Gateway, which was a lunar space station that was going around the moon, and that was meant to be a gateway to Mars, gateway to extra. Um, I will say extra. I can't remember extraplanetary uh, not investigation, discovery, exploration, excuse me, because it means that you're not going from, like, if you're not careful, you're going to get to the point where you're going from um, Florida to Mars all in one go. And that's a long distance to go where there's nothing on the way. And so putting the moon as sort of a waypoint along the way, it's definitely a safety thing. But then
So
also,
that's going to be like a 7-Eleven is under
Yeah,
your.
kind of. Yeah, it's a lot closer to home than it is. I mean,
So
you
fuel
know,
and
yeah, yeah, it could
provision.
be for fueling. There's been talks about things like, will we construct craft to go to Mars in space? That's something that gets talked about because one of the things that NASA does a lot is they build what's called purpose built craft. So purpose built spacecraft that only really do one job, and so or can only operate in one environment. The lunar lander is a great example of that. It's really only meant to work on the moon, the one from the '60s. And so in this circumstance, we're talking about the ability to build a craft that can fly from the moon to Mars and then um, back again, but like maybe it never touches the ground. It just stays in orbit and they do landers and everything. And so that's why, you want to do something like that. On the flip side, though, I think it's very important to talk about NASA's mission and the space program on the global space program's mission as a whole as well, right? So when you're on the moon, right, you can observe the Earth. It's part of NASA's mandate, for example, within their mandate that they are doing Earth planetary sciences and Earth sciences. So NASA studies the oceans, they study CO2 emissions, they study all this stuff. So being on the moon allows you to kind of step back from being in low Earth orbit when you're really close and you don't get a wide view, and you kind of step back and see what else is happening. And there's other things about that too. Like I've long theorized, right, that actually we had a meteorite come into the atmosphere, I think in Ohio or Illinois earlier this week, and there's long been discussion in the general space nerd world that well, if you're on the moon, you can start to be on the dark side of it, and you can watch for really big things that could come and hit us, right? I mean, we've all heard about these near misses that there are expected in
Yeah.
20 years or whatever. So it's kind of a mixture of that. So why the moon is so important is that. What I will say though is there's a bit of a we're in a space race now. We're in a moon race right now for sure. Very clearly there are two main players, right? There's NASA's working to get astronauts on the moon, and then the Chinese space program is also working to get there. I think they're called taikonauts on the moon. So there's definitely a bit of a race to get there. I won't really talk about that any more than that, just because I'm sure somebody's going to make a comment that I won't agree with or whatever. But ultimately, that is a truth statement, right? Like NASA's trying to return first. We know there's been claims that we'll have taikonauts there by
Competition
2030.
drives a lot of things.
Yeah, competition drives a lot of things, but
Right.
they want to show off their their expertise, right? And that's what they're doing. So hopefully that answers your question.
It did. It did. So, I mean, I've always, and, I don't have a connection to this space other than my dad worked for NASA before becoming a neuroscientist. He was a biologist
Right.
that focused on human spaceflight, right? So, and, it's one of those kind of, I think, life shaping events for him because he talked
Yeah.
about it for the rest of his life. So I've
Sure.
always been fascinated by it. And one of the things that I've always looked at it as is a natural extension of humans' desire to understand things,
Yeah.
which I think, is very stoic, right?
Hmm.
The idea that we have reason and we should use it, and wisdom essentially to me isn't just knowing a lot of things, it's wanting to know more. And that's what I directly connect with the exploration of space. Well,
Yeah.
I obviously live in a place that has a lot of mountains. The old saying with mountain climbers, why'd you climb a mountain? Because it was there. That's why I think. I mean, why are we going into space? Because we can,
Yeah.
right? And I think I'm an easy sell. That's not, but that I shouldn't be used as an example of every person that contributes to the. I
Yeah.
mean, that's why I'm going in so much detail with you, at least as much as we can in a
Sure.
podcast,
Yeah.
uh, about why this is important. But I do think from the Stoic side, from the time that they were sitting at the agora on the
Hmm.
Stoa and looking up, somebody in Zeno's crowd was going, I wonder what's out there. I wonder if somebody's out there looking at us and our little dot.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's somebody here.
Yeah.
And I do think that's been a perpetual, not just the Stoics, but a part of philosophy ever since. If
Yeah.
are we alone?
Yeah.
I think most scientists, and I grew up around scientists, would agree that the chances that we're alone are very slim.
Yeah.
Looking at what's the Drake equation or any
Yeah.
equation ultimately,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
says, hmm, there's billions of solar systems, potentially billions of galaxies. Obviously, something there is going to be close to our version of life, but of course there could be other versions of life.
Yeah.
So that I think is something that every philosophy has probably grappled with. But I do think Stoics would have a particular connection to it because ultimately part of the philosophy is to explore. It's to try to learn new things. It's to
Yeah.
um, the promotion of science, if you will. And
Yeah.
science. whether it's micro or macro, um, is about finding new things, and it's about having an open mind to it. Now, I mean, as soon as you bring this up, then you start hearing all the conspiracies about this, that, and the other, and our, Area 51 and all that.
Oh
I don't
yeah.
know any of that. So just
People
because
ask me that question all the time, and I'm like, I have no idea.
I'm not promoting that,
Yeah.
I have no idea is my
Yeah.
question.
For
Um,
sure.
but I do believe, because very smart people have told me, that the
Yeah.
chances of extraterrestrial life are very high, and certainly higher than not. The idea that we'd be on, one rock and one mediocre solar system, and one essentially mediocre galaxy, and where that is like, I don't know, egotistical to the to the extreme. So,
Yeah.
what do you think about philosophy's view of all of this space travel? What's out there? Are we alone? And
Yeah.
how do you think it equates to our particular philosophy of Stoicism?
Well, I mean, the first step that you can take very easily is the step towards this the Stoic concept of view from above, right? Which is literally when astronauts are doing that, right? They are literally above. There's a famous trivia bit, which is when you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the part that's where you are the furthest from all land possible. The closest you are is the closest humans to you are actually those on the International Space Station. And there's sort of a funny thing about that. So they're basically always above you. And every astronaut talks about something they call the overview effect. And it's that idea that, and many astronauts have spoken about this. It's that idea that you step out and you are literally above everything now, and you realize, that we are very small, we are very protected by the ecosystem and the ozone layer and things like that, but ultimately, there's no lines on that globe when you look at it, right? And so there's definitely, there's a transition away from us versus them thinking. There's definitely, like, people talk about it as a shared responsibility for spacecraft Earth, right? And so it takes out all of this local stuff and makes it very much bigger. There's a very famous example from Apollo 8 when they were rounding around the moon. They had their very first photo of something called Earthrise, which was where the Earth was rising above the horizon of the moon. And there's that, and then you guard into when we get really far out there, like the Voyager probe, and it takes a photo called it's a photo from I think it's Neptune
Oh,
or
I know. You're
Uranus.
talking about the
The pale blue
family
dot.
photo, the pale. I
The pale
have a
blue dot.
story on that, but
Okay,
yes,
yeah.
it was. I
So
think
that's
NASA called it the family photo, a family
yeah, like
photo album
literally
or
every
something.
human in existence has lived or
Yeah.
died on that little dot.
Yes.
And that's one of those things, I think, that where you have a parallel between the philosophy we practice and this real world event that happens, right? And I think that's a big part of why, the lingo you get within the space program is like, we're in this together, we're trying to get somewhere, right? So, yes, something can be led by NASA or can be led by the European Space Agency or whichever, but within the space program, there's generally a feeling that I get, which is like, we want to fly, we want to explore, we want to see what we can get to up there. And I'll quickly speak to the aliens thing, only because I do get asked this a lot. In fact, I was at a wedding a couple of years ago, and I think I was in an aliens conversation for about 2 hours at the dinner table, and I remember that it was a friend of mine's partner, and he was asking me all these questions. She sort of mouthed to me like, "I'm sorry," and I said, "No, no, no, it's okay. I get this question all the time." What I think is really weird is sort of this thing of, why does it always go to like killer aliens? Like, it's never ET, or it's never, a nice one. It's always the bad ones. And it's like, hold on a second.
I think it's because we're
I
projecting.
Yeah, I think we're projecting because we're scared because we don't know what's out there, and I totally agree with
No,
that.
every time humans went somewhere, it was catastrophic for the humans that were there.
Right, right. We're
That's
projecting our
just
own. Yeah,
we're projecting our own purposes for exploration.
yeah, for sure.
Is
And
exploitation, and we
yeah,
already had this. It was called. Remember the colonialism?
yes, we did have that, and I think you're right. This is space colonialism at its best, I guess. But I think
Hopefully,
the
we don't
thing
do that.
No, hopefully we don't do that. I like to quote Jodie Foster's character from the movie Contact. As much as there's so much science fiction to that film, I think it represents my view on it very well, which is like there are hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions probably of stars out there, right? And if just 1% of those have planets, right, that are in a solar system, right, there are still hundreds of thousands of solar systems out there. Then if out of all those hundreds of thousands of them, there's 1% of those have planets in a Goldilocks zone, like on Earth, where you get liquid water and all that, right? There's still probably hundreds of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of planets that are like ours in the Goldilocks zone for a star. And if just 1% of all of those have life, and maybe even intelligent life, that's still thousands of planets out there that could potentially have intelligent life on it. And
Right. And
if
that's life
it's
as we know it, which doesn't
life as we
necessarily
know it,
mean
exactly. But I'll say just life in terms of a consciousness or a sentient life.
sure, yeah.
And if you get all the way to the end of that sort of equation, right, then there's still thousands of options there, right? So if in fact it's the opposite, where there's nothing out there and we are literally the only sentient conscious, species in the universe, that seems like a pretty big waste of space. And I would
Sure
argue
does.
that science always finds a way, like the science of life always finds a way to exist. Do I think aliens are out there? Probably. Do I think they're here to do things you see in the movies? I don't think so, frankly. I hate to be that guy, but I don't. Like, I don't think there's like people being lifted up and all that is something that they really want to do to us. It just seems a little weird, right? Like we're obviously sentient enough to communicate. It would seem weird for us, an advanced species, to do that. There is that thing though, where if somebody gets to us first, they're obviously far more advanced in space travel than we are, and
Yes.
we'd
That's
be,
why there was
you
somewhat
know,
of a discussion, my dad told me, about what we should put on these deep space probes that was
that's right,
so
yeah,
descriptive of us. Like
yeah,
being a military national security guy, the idea that we would
yeah,
put our DNA and every language that we speak and, the
yeah,
exact layout of our anatomy and physiology, generally speaking, is a stupid idea. I'm
yeah,
just saying. I know that scientists were thinking that there was going to be some benevolent being that recovered
yeah,
this and was just going to be, oh wow, these guys are really cool,
yeah,
rather than, oh wow, these guys just told us the key to how to defeat them. I guess it takes both sides. I guess how you
yeah,
view the
yeah.
world.
Yeah, there is a theory out there called the dark forest theory, which is like if it is thousands of habitable people out there, why haven't we met them before? The first side, the sort of more benevolent or benign side of it, I guess I would say, is the one where we don't know where they are because they don't know where we are because we're all so far apart, and we know faster than light travel is incredibly difficult, right? So you get to the point where you wouldn't run into them anyways, right? Then there's the flip side, which is the dark forest theory, which is where essentially everybody out there is trying to stay real quiet because they're all worried that that once they make themselves known, they're gonna get blown up. Is essentially how it kind of looks.
Oh, it's stupid.
And
There's also
yeah,
the point that they could have come and gone, right?
that's
I
right.
mean, like we could have had millions
Yeah,
of intelligent life forms that came and went extinct,
yeah,
either
yeah, yeah,
because their solar system, every star eventually burns out.
yeah,
I mean, there's a
yeah,
finite life to everything in the universe, right? So
yeah.
that could have been the case. I mean, just think about just a couple hundred years ago for
Hmm.
humans. Super smart, very little emanation that would have been picked up by anything anywhere else,
Yeah, yeah,
right? I
for
mean,
sure.
I mean, what was it? Unfortunately, Hitler's broadcast was the first thing they say actually would have made it into
Somewhere far
space.
away. Yeah,
So if you went back into the 1800s, obviously pretty sophisticated animals then,
yeah,
there would have been nothing emanating. So there would have been, and that,
yeah.
so
Well,
there's all sorts of, you know,
yeah, and there's a light challenge here, right? Where light has a finite speed. It does. It travels at a finite speed. So the challenge you get, I mean, of course, that's relate. There's scientific things I could say that show that light can speed up and slow down depending on it. I'm not going to get into that part, but ultimately, light is relatively finite. So there are civilizations out there, for example, that if they're watching us, if they have the ability to see all the way down to the surface of the Earth, that they're probably seeing dinosaurs, right? They're not seeing us. Like
Hmm.
the light that is being emitted from Earth right now is taking so long to get out there that they wouldn't, like, at best they're probably seeing, like, well, they might be seeing the Romans right now, right? You never know.
They're all
And
becoming
you kind of,
Stoics.
yeah, exactly. They're looking
That's
at
what I'm
they're
thinking.
looking at Socrates, they're looking at Plato. But it's an interesting concept, right? But I don't know. In some ways though, like, I think as much as the extraterrestrial topic is a very interesting one, right? Being in the space program, right? We all look in the space program. Many of us look at this really as the benefits it brings to home, and I think this is where there's a parallel with Stoicism as well. Like, um, people are sort of like, why are we sending some guy to the moon, right? And okay, yeah, we've talked about some of those topics already, but the space program as well. And I can tell a very good story about this. It has benefited humanity in different ways that I think a lot of people don't really know. There are a lot of technologies that the space program has helped develop, that are being used every day today. So, for example, I have to call it hook and loop fabric because that's what it's supposed to be called. You would know it as Velcro, right? But Velcro actually is really important, right, in this circumstance because it has uses for people. For example, like my grandfather was never able to tie his shoelaces after a certain age because his hands were too much trouble. Like, that seems small, but that did come from the space program, right? It's like microwaves. NASA and the space program, as well as other space programs, do development of aerospace technologies. So there's a lot of advancements that I could probably thousands of them that for planes, like the little wing that's on your plane wings, right? Those are all developed from that. I mean, and then you get into other things where you have technologies, high functioning technologies that are used. So a great story of my career was before I worked with the space program and before I joined the company I work for now, I worked for a company called Synaptive Medical. And Synaptive Medical utilized Canadarm technology. So the Canadarm is the robot arm. At the time, there was only one, right? Or there was only two that had come about, which was the Canadarm on the space shuttle and Canadarm 2 on the ISS. And my company used Canadarm technology in a robot arm built terrestrially to use. The robot arm was used for assisted neurosurgical operations. So it was what you call a robotic exoscopic microscope. So it was basically an optical payload, a camera on the end of a robot arm, and all the tech from that we were partnered with the company that builds the Canadarms, but all the tech from that was used from that, and so and I was very lucky when I was working at Synaptive and when I was working in the medical field to medical device field to meet actual patients where it was like they one day they fell over and it turned out they had a tumor or they had a blood clot or they had something, right, and then they were treated and then they used the technology, and there were different pieces of the technology. It wasn't just a robot arm, but they used the technology including the robot arm, and they were operated on, and they one day they walk out of the hospital, and then the guy that I had met, for example, 2 weeks later he was playing frisbee with his daughter and riding bikes in the park. And those are times when, and I think this is a Stoic thing where pushing yourselves to find what's across the horizon, pushing yourself to see what's past the next ridge, what's over the next mountain range, what's the next frontier. Um, it seems like a land grab, but in reality, the technologies, all those things you develop, they do have a knock on effect in the world today. Has it always been like that in history? Yes and no. But in the space program, it definitely is, right? Like, the space program agencies are public agencies. They're developing technology in conjunction with, we call them IPs, industrial partners. And this kind of technology you will see on a shelf. Is it tomorrow you'll see it? No, but you'll see it now. I mean, radio technology, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, like, GPS, these are all things that NASA and other space agencies have had a part in. And So I think there's a stoic thing where there is an exploration side of it, but there's also that idea of like, are you doing something good with it? And I think the answer is yes. All the time, it's hard to see the direct line, but in reality, I do think there is that question. Like, if it is not good, do not do it. Right? I think that's Marcus. But the reality is that you know many of these things are good. Many of these things are helping, and sometimes they're big picture helping, like you said, like macro, where we're mapping, ocean warming patterns. We're mapping carbon dioxide patterns, ozone layer patterns, right? Like everybody remembers CFCs in the '90s destroying the ozone layer. Well, you know that was studied using satellites that were put up by space programs, right? And we eventually made the change to not include those materials, and then CFCs reduced, and the ozone layer kind of, I can't remember if it fixed itself or it just kind of adapted, but like whatever, we're in a better position now with the ozone than we were back then. So there are fundamental changes that you can bring to things with this, because so many people ask me, they're like, "Well, we're not doing this finite thing of like building more homes or something like that." And I would say no, but at the same time, the technology we develop, maybe we build homes faster, better, stronger. And I definitely think there's a stoic aspect to that of like taking your knowledge and applying it and learning how to do it better, and being better every day. That's a long-winded answer to sort of answer your question. Hopefully I got there.
So I think you did. Going back to the Voyager 1
Yeah.
example, because
Yeah,
I
you had a
used to have
story, I
that
think, about it.
picture. If people aren't familiar with this, I would recommend you become familiar with it. But Voyager 1, I think it was, because I remember this pretty distinctly, 4 billion miles away from Earth, when the famous scientist Carl Sagan, suggested that they turn it around and take one more picture before they shut down uh, all the cameras, because they needed to preserve energy as it
That's right.
went into deep space. And then there was apparently a discussion because they were concerned that if you turn it around and point it that direction, you could damage the photographic equipment because it would be looking
Yeah.
close at the sun. But they did it anyway. And the picture, I think, it's got to be one of the most famous pictures ever taken, right? Because you already mentioned that literally everybody that ever existed was on this pale blue dot.
Yeah.
Hence the name of the picture, or at least the poem. And I won't read the whole poem, but I would suggest people that are interested in space travel do, and just humanity and philosophy. But the one
Yeah.
passage that always stuck with me was, "Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." And it really does kind of put you in your place, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, the way the universe looks at Earth and everything in it is micro.
Yeah.
It's micro. We tend to view it as everything, when in fact it really does, I think, put us in our place.
Hmm.
So I know we're about out of time, but any parting shots or any last comments that you'd have, Adam?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a very direct parallel I think I would like to bring forward from the space program, which is, this parallel is around, because Artemis, for example, Artemis II has been delayed a lot. There's been a lot of technological delays on stuff, and that happens. But um, I think it's very important to highlight one thing that the space program does very well is we sit there, and aerospace in general does very well, which is, a Stoic concept that they would maybe not use it, but a Stoic concept called premeditatio malorum, which is the premeditation of bad things or adversity. I work in space safety, manned space flight safety to be exact. And what we do is we imagine not ridiculous things, but we imagine real things that can go wrong, and what will happen when they happen. So you expect them to go wrong. And it's a very important concept in the space program, is this idea that stuff will go badly. We know that. We have lost astronauts before, right? But stuff will go badly. And how do we work to prevent that? And instead of running from the problem or covering it up, not that anybody's doing that, but instead of doing that, you take action. You find out How do I fix it? What's the engineering problem? How do I do that? And the competence that we bring to the table with that, and I'll quote a Chris Hadfield quote, "I am Canadian," right? Which was along the line, I think it's a paraphrase, but it's basically the best antidote for fear is competence. And how do you get competence? In my world, it's by asking what's going to go wrong? How are we going to fix it? How do we prevent it? What do we do if it happens? Actually, it's what if we do when it happens, right? And that's why we get so successful. That's why things last. That's why, the Canadarm's been up there for 20 years. The ISS has been up there for 20 years. And I think this is something I want people to take away when they hear delays or they hear this or that. It's because we know when things could go really bad. And we try to make sure that we take action to do that. And as human beings and as Stoics, I think we can always take a chance on thinking about those things and doing what we can to make sure that they don't happen. Or that we know what will happen if and when they happen, and then go from there. So long-winded answer to say yes, there's something to add there, but I urge everyone to take a look at your space program books in your library, in your bookstore. Butch Wilmore, who commanded the Boeing Starliner flight, he just wrote a book called Stuck in Space. Highly recommend that. He's got a great chapter on when things started to go wrong up there and how they were handling it. And I think, there are lessons that anybody can take and use in their day-to-day when we're not in a life or death split-second environment. But yeah, that's my closing answer, I guess I would say. What about yourself, Mick? Do you have any closing thoughts for us? Then we'll wrap.
I had it already. Read the poem. I think it really puts a lot of things into perspective.
Great. Well, we're going to be launching this episode, hopefully coincident with the Artemis II launch, but we'd love to hear from you. info@pubandporch.com. Like, subscribe, comment on the video, send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. The space program is great because it always brings up a lot of discussion and debate. And I really hope that we can hear from everybody with this new endeavor, which is really exciting. It's our first time back at the moon since 1972. So very exciting. All right, Mick, we'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.
Sláinte. Thank you for listening to the Pub and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pubandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pubandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pub and Porch out.